Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to talk about a feeling today, a really big shift that's happening inside some of our most important cultural spaces. Yep, we're talking about museums.
So, let's just dive right into this, because it's a question a lot of us have probably felt, even if we couldn't quite name it. You know that feeling? You walk into a museum these days and it just hits different. The wall text might actually question itself. You might get asked how you feel, what your story is. It's less like a silent holy temple and way more like a real active conversation. So what on earth is going on? We're going to unpack the huge changes that are flipping these institutions on their heads.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look back at that classic, super confident temple museum. Then, we'll see how that whole idea got put on trial. After that, we'll get into this new mood, this kind of yes-and feeling that's popping up. We'll even see how technology fits into all of this, and then we'll wrap up with the biggest question of all. In today's world, what is a museum even for?
All right, let's start at the beginning. To really get what's happening today, we have to understand the kind of museum that was the standard for like 100 years. This was the museum as an absolute authority, an institution with unshakable confidence, and it was a direct product of this thing called modernism.
So, modernism. It was basically a worldview built on pure confidence. It came out of the Enlightenment, this really powerful idea that if we just used science and reason, humanity would keep getting better and better forever. It loved what we call grand narratives, these massive, one-size-fits-all stories that could explain everything. And the key words here, for sure, are universal truth. Modernism was convinced that some things, some truths, some ideas of beauty, were just true for everybody, everywhere, no exceptions. It was all about creating order and telling one single, clean story for all of humanity.
And you can see how that modernist swagger was literally baked into the museum itself. I mean, think about it, a temple of knowledge. You went there to receive wisdom, not to ask questions. The curator, they were like the high priest, telling you the one single correct story. Even those clean white gallery rooms, the white cube, were designed to feel totally neutral, like you were just experiencing pure art in a vacuum. But you know, there was a really dark side to this. Ethnographic museums were collecting objects from indigenous cultures under this idea of salvaging them, basically taking them out of their living context and putting them in a case like a dead butterfly. The whole system was a one-way street. The all-knowing museum talked, and you, the visitor, just listened.
But then, things started to change. Starting around the middle of the 20th century, a bunch of intellectual earthquakes just started rattling the foundations of that temple. A whole new way of thinking came along that looked at all those big, confident claims and said, I'm not so sure about that. And this, right here, was the start of postmodernism.
Okay, hermeneutics of suspicion. I know, it's a mouthful, but it's such a great phrase. It just means learning to be suspicious, to read between the lines of anything that claims to be the absolute truth. Postmodernism, along with really powerful ideas from feminism and post-colonial theory, looked at that old-school museum and asked one simple, devastating question. Whose truth are you telling? It argued that those so-called universal stories weren't universal at all. They were just the stories of the powerful, mostly white European men, dressed up to look like the story of everyone. And that whole claim of being neutral, that was seen as the most clever trick of all, because it hid all the political decisions, all the people who were being left out of the story, right in plain sight.
Let's just pause and really look at this, because this chart shows a complete 180. The museum goes from a temple of knowledge to a courtroom, where its own history is on trial. Confidence? Gone. Replaced by suspicion. That one big universal truth? It shatters into a million little fragmented truths. Authority is out, critique is in. And the goal is no longer to give you stable, easy answers. The goal is to show you that meaning is always being fought over. And that objective voice of God narration, well, it's revealed to be just another voice, one with its own biases and its own agenda. This wasn't just a small change. It was a radical rethinking of what a museum is supposed to do.
And this idea, it got boiled down into 4 powerful words. This started a whole movement. Museums are not neutral. This slogan is the perfect summary of that postmodern turn. It's a direct challenge to the idea of the neutral white cube. The argument is pretty simple. Every single choice a museum makes is a political choice. What they decide to buy, what they decide to hang on the wall, what they write on the little label next to it, and crucially, what they decide to leave in the basement. It's all political. There's no neutral ground. Even being silent is a political choice. And this idea really forced museums to start looking in the mirror and confronting their own role in some pretty unequal systems.
Now, this is so important. This wasn't just a bunch of academics arguing.
It had a massive, gut-punch impact on what you actually saw on the gallery walls. The classic example is an exhibition by an artist named Fred Wilson. He went into the collection of a historical society, but he didn't bring in anything new. He just rearranged things. So he took these beautiful, fancy silver teapots, the symbols of the wealth of slave-owning families, and he put them in a case right next to a pair of raw iron slave shackles that had been sitting in storage, never shown to the public. And with that one move, wow. He used the museum's own stuff to expose the brutal story that was hiding behind its clean, polite history. He wasn't telling a new story, he was just showing the part of the story the museum had been ignoring. It's what we call institutional critique, using the institution to critique itself.
So, we've torn the whole thing down. Now what? Well, after a few decades of this intense critique, you started to get this feeling of critique fatigue. I mean, the postmodern project was absolutely vital for exposing injustice, but it could also feel a little cynical. If everything's just about power and nothing has stable meaning, where do you go from there? And this is where we start to see a new feeling, a new sensibility start to bubble up. Some people are calling it metamodernism.
The key word on this slide for me is oscillates. It means it swings back and forth. See, metamodernism isn't about throwing out all that postmodern critique and just going back to being naive. It's about trying to hold both ideas in your head at the same time. It's like saying, okay, I totally get it. I know grand stories can be dangerous, I know institutions aren't neutral, and I know sincerity can be faked, but it still really wants to feel those modernist things: enthusiasm, hope, connection, genuine belief. It's about trying to be sincere after you've become cynical. It's trying to build something new, even when you know it's never going to be perfect.
This quote just nails that balancing act. Let's break it down. Sincere but self-aware. That means allowing yourself to have a real emotional reaction to something, but also having that little voice in your head that remembers the context. Idealistic but not naive. That's wanting to believe that museums can do good in the world without forgetting their often messy and sometimes violent histories. And emotionally open yet critically reflexive. That's letting yourself be moved by something but still being aware of how that feeling is being shaped for you. It's this constant pendulum swing between your heart and your head.
So what does this new mood actually look like in a museum? Well, the whole mission changes. It's not enough to just critique anymore. The goal is now critique plus repair. You see a new focus on emotions, on wellness, on the idea that a museum can be a place for healing. And community collaboration becomes absolutely central. This is where we see a huge shift from representation to relation. And that's key. It's the difference between a museum talking about a community and a museum working with the community. And it's all wrapped up in this idea of yes and. It's museums saying, yes, this object has a history of colonial violence, and it's a beautiful, powerful piece of heritage that we can still be moved by. It refuses to give you a simple black and white answer.
Okay, and here's a really wild twist in the story. This is where this new mood slams right into cutting-edge technology like artificial intelligence. And in a lot of ways, AI is the perfect tool for this moment, because it lives in that weird space between what's real and what's made up, what's fact and what's a guess.
So, picture this. You have a beautiful ancient textile, but parts of it have been destroyed. You can now train an AI on thousands of other patterns from that culture and have it, well, hallucinate what the missing pieces might have looked like. Then you display this speculative reconstruction. Now, the classic postmodern voice in your head would immediately scream, "That's a fake! It's a digital lie!" And you know what? That's not wrong. But the metamodern response is a little different. It says, yes, we know it's a construction, we're not trying to fool anyone, and we are going to choose to engage with it as if it were real, to let ourselves feel a connection to the whole that was lost. It's this sort of informed naivete. You know the trick, but you let yourself be amazed by the magic anyway.
Okay, but we have to put a huge pause here, a really, really important one. There's a real danger with all this talk about feelings and repair. Because when you're talking about ethnographic museums, places that hold objects taken during colonial rule, the conversation can't just be about a new mood. The central issue is justice. The calls for decolonization and restitution, which means literally giving stolen objects back, that's not just about making people feel better. It's a hard political demand about who owns history. So, the crucial takeaway here is that while this new language of repair can be useful, it can't ever be used as an excuse to soften or sidestep those urgent demands for justice.
So, after this whole journey, from the confident temple through the fiery courtroom and into this new, complicated mood of repair, where does that leave the museum today? What is it actually for anymore?
I think this chart is probably the best way to understand it. It's not like one stage ended and the next one began. It's more like they're all layered on top of each other right now.
You have the museum's conscience, its brain, its ethical code, which is totally shaped by all that postmodern critique. It thinks in terms of postcolonialism, feminism, and anti-racism. But then you have the museum's aspiration. You could call it its heart, how it wants to act. And that is leaning more and more toward these metamodern ideas. It's trying to find a way to be sincere after being cynical, a way to show care after decades of critique, a way to have hope that isn't naive.
And you can see this isn't just a vibe. It's becoming official. The International Council of Museums sets the global definition of what a museum is, and their brand new definition from 2022 is totally different from the old ones. The old definitions were all about things, collecting objects, preserving them. But just look at this new language. Participation of communities, fostering diversity, operating ethically, reflection. These are the words of relationship, of responsibility, of repair. The official rulebook for museums has absorbed the critique and is now trying to build something new based on connection and care.
And that, I think, brings us to the heart of it. The old modernist museum thought its job was to give you the answers. The critical postmodern museum saw its job as pointing out all the problems with those answers. But maybe the museum of today and tomorrow has a different job entirely. Maybe its purpose isn't to be a temple or a courtroom, but something more like a public living room. A place where we don't get final truths, but where we get the space and the permission to just sit with our most difficult, most complicated, most emotional questions, and to hold them together. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.